Today I'm going to be making shaker doors for my upper cabinets and then also one for the cabinet underneath my sink. Shaker doors are really easy to make. You just need to have a miter saw, or you could even do it with a hand saw or a power saw to cut them off. You want them to be really square though, so a miter saw is really nice. And then also a way to take off material, either a router or a table saw. Doesn't have to be a fancy table saw, but some type of table saw is really nice. So I'm going to show you exactly how I do that. So the first thing is I have my face frames for my upper cabinets. These pieces are in temporarily, but I know how big my openings are going to be. And what I want to do is I want my cabinets to hang over these by about 1/2 inch on the top and the bottom. And then on these cabinets, I'm going to have a real tight spacing, about 1/8 of an inch in between the cabinets. So I just need to figure out how far they're going to overhang on the two ends, and then I can get the overall dimensions of my cabinets. And so what I've determined is that my cabinets are going to be 24 5/16 long and 12 inches high. That's going to give me some about a little over 1 inch of overhang on the top and the bottom, and just a little bit on the side, so that I have a real tight gap between each door. And you'll see how that comes together. But I'm going to show you kind of how you figure out your dimensions, because it can be a little bit tricky. So let's take a look at that. So here is kind of a really rough sketch of the doors. So you have these pieces on the sides, and those are called the rails. You can kind of think of them as the rails on a railroad track. And then the ones that come across are called the stiles. And the rails are going to be the full length of the cabinet. So because my cabinet's doors are going to be 12 inches tall, the rails are going to be 12 inches. But the stiles actually have a piece that fits in to a groove in the rails. And so you have to kind of figure out how the dimensions, the overall dimensions, I know I want them to be 24 5/16 long. So the pieces, what I'm going to be using for my shaker doors, the trim is 2.5 inches wide. So I've got a 2.5 inch rail on each side. So 2.5 and 2.5 is 5 inches. So I have calculated, I want my cabinets to be 24 5/16. I subtract that 5 inches on each side. That gives me 19 5/16 as the space in between here. But then I want them to hang over. There's kind of a tab that's 1/2 inch long that's going to insert into the rails. And so I want to add an inch back in, 1/2 inch on each side. So that means that these pieces are going to be 20 5/16. And then that's going to give me an overall width of 24 5/16. Okay, so what I'm going to do first, I'm going to cut down my stock to those lengths. Now for my the shaker trim around the exterior, I like to use poplar. Poplar is fairly hard. It's harder than pine. It's also straighter than pine, resists to warping more. And so it gives you a really nice finish that doesn't ding up. I use that for my face frames and my doors. And then the inside panel will be a piece of Baltic birch 1/4 inch plywood. I'm using my miter saw to cut down the pieces to length, and I like to use a stop block, and that way I can get repeated cuts that are exactly the same every time. I trim off the end just so that I know I have a good square end on each side, and then just want to double check and make sure that my stop block is set in the right place, and once it is, I go ahead and cut the pieces. Now once I've got all of the longer pieces cut, which are the ones that run across the top and the bottom and are called the rails, see, I got it right that time, then I set up my stop block for the shorter pieces, the up and down pieces, which are the stiles. Now, because my pieces wouldn't reach my stop block, I just used a block of wood to do that, and then I went ahead and cut all of those pieces down to 12 inches. See how much faster it is when you use a stop block? Love it. Now, moving over to the table saw, the next thing I'm going to do is make a groove in all of these pieces so that my 1/4-inch Baltic birch plywood can slide into it. And I'm going to use setup blocks. It's just an easy way to get the proper depth and width on these pieces. Now, I know that I want this groove to be about 1/4 of an inch, just a hair over so that the piece slides. So if I'm using, my pieces are 3/4 of an inch wide and I want this to be right down the center, then I'm going to set my my fence on my table saw 1/4 an inch from the edge. This table saw blade is 1/8 of an inch wide, which is pretty standard. It's called the kerf. The standard kerf is 1/8 of an inch. And so if I run it through, I'm going to make 1/8 of an inch groove, and then I'm going to flip it around and run it through again and make another 1/8 of an inch groove, and those combined will be 1/4 inch, and you'll see how that works. Then I want the depth to be 1/2 of an inch because that's how far inset I want the panels to be. Then I run a test piece through so that I can make sure I have everything dialed in. So I run it through once, and that cuts that 1/8 of an inch wide groove, and then I flip it around and run it again, and that cuts another 1/8 of an inch groove right next to it, and that makes the 1/4 inch, and it makes it exactly dead center. Then I just want to take the Baltic birch and make sure that it fits in, and I want it to fit in and slide. I don't want it to be too tight. So I can adjust the width of my cut to get that just how I want it. Now I'm ready to run all of the pieces through. Before I do that, I like to make a mark on each one so that I always have the same side facing out. Then I just go ahead and run all of my pieces through. So these rails and stiles are going to be held together with mortise and tenon joints. And the mortise is the groove that we already cut. So now the tenon is going to be kind of like a tab that fits into that groove. And the way we're going to create that is just by taking a little bit of the material off the end. So I set my fence up 1/2 an inch from the blade because I want to take off a 1/2 an inch because I want that tenon to fit into the 1/2 inch groove. And then I'm going to set it at 1/4 inch height. And I'm just going to kind of take off the material a little bit at a time and fit it into that joint, test fit it until I get it to fit really nicely. So I keep shaving off a little bit of material at a time. And I could do this with a dado blade that was wider and would take off more material, but I like to use my regular blade because that way I can really fine tune it and make just adjustments that I needed. So I take off the material on one side 1/4 of an inch high, and then I do it on the other side, and I just kind of move my piece back and forth until I take all the material out. And once I get all the material removed, you can see what it looks like. And I'll show you how that fits into the groove on the other board. Now this is just a sample piece that I'm getting everything set up, but here's the piece. I'll have the tenon will fit into that groove, and I want it to fit snugly, and it's going to be held together with glue. So you don't want it too tight or there's no room for the glue, but you want it to fit pretty snug. So once I get everything dialed in, then I do one more sample piece just to make sure that everything fits perfectly. And you can see that looks pretty darn good. So then I just run all the pieces through, and this can be a little bit tedious, but you want to be careful so that you don't make any mistakes and so that you're always safe. So just take your time and run everything through. Now that you've got all of your rails and stiles ready to go, It's ready to I like to test fit everything together. And remember that mark I put on one side of each piece? I want to make sure that all of the marks are facing up. And then I just dry fit them together and make sure everything fits properly. And then I just want to measure for my panel. And remember, those grooves are a 1/2 inch each. So I just want my panels to be 1 inch larger than the opening. So I just measure that, write those down, and then cut those panels on my table saw. And I just had some scrap pieces of Baltic birch plywood laying around, so I used those. They worked out well. And I like to use Baltic birch because it's really smooth, has a nice finish, tanks paint really well, and also it's very stable, so you don't have any problems with it warping or splitting. Then, once I have the center panels cut, I can just test assemble everything one more time before I glue it all up. And as you can see, everything fit together really nicely. Really clean joints here. Now I'm ready to glue up the shaker doors, and you just want to use glue on the mortise and tenons. You don't need it on the panel. You want that actually to have a little bit of movement so it can expand and contract. You want to use plenty of glue because you want this to be really strong, and it's okay if you have a bunch of squeeze out because you can always wipe that up and sand it down later. But put quite a bit of glue. And then I normally would not use any nails, but because it's in a van, just to make it a little bit extra solid because of all the vibration, I use a couple of 1/2 inch 18 gauge brad nails in each of the joints. And I just put these nails to where they'll just go through the little tenon, the tab that's sticking into the groove. And that's going to hold them in place along with the glue. They'll be rock solid. Now, one little tip, if you have these labels on your lumber, take it off with a heat gun. If you just heat it up, they'll peel right off and they won't leave any adhesive. If you try to peel them off and then sand them, it's just all gummy and it's really hard to make them clean. Now you're going to have some little gaps in your joints, and what I do is I just take some white glue and mix a little bit of sawdust in there to make kind of a slurry, and then I just use that sort of like a putty to fill in the gaps, and it'll fill them in really nicely and you won't even be able to see them. So next I moved on to making my faces for my drawers. And for this I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, and then I'll put edge banding on it to finish off the edge so you don't see the plywood edge. Now I want my drawer faces to overhang the face frame of my kitchen galley by 1/2 inch on each side. So I determined that I needed to make my pieces 13 inches wide, and then the top 3 drawers are 7 1/4 inches tall, and the bottom one is 10 5/16. And I just determined that based on the size of my galley. You'll just want to determine, how tall and how wide you want your drawer faces to be. So I cut all these down. Now, like I said, I use edge banding, and it's really easy to apply. I get it on Amazon, and I'll link to it in the description. What I use is birch edge banding, so it's real birch and it has a heat activated adhesive, so you just trim it down to size, the length that you want, and then use an iron to heat it up, and you just go over it for, hold it in each spot for 10 or 15 seconds, and then let it cool before you try and trim it so that it's stuck down really well and doesn't peel up. Then I just trim off all the ends by scoring it with a knife, and then I use this little handy dandy edge band trimmer that I got on Amazon, and I'll link to it in the description, and that just trims down the edges so that it's flush with the side of the piece. And there you have it, all of the drawer faces and cabinet doors. Next step, we'll sand them and get them painted.